Well, hello everyone. Buzu and Dinoy Manadak, Ray Najish Nakas. I am Dr. Ray Taylor with the University of Minnesota, as well as the Board of Veterinary Medicine and Natives in Vet Med. I'm very happy to have you join us today for our Maddie's Conversations and have an amazing co-host today. And I'll hand it over to Miguel.
Thank you. Hey, folks. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Miguel Rolas. I'm the Director of Community Animal Care with CARE. And we will go ahead and jump straight into our question of the day today so that we have as much time as possible for our lovely presentation. So our question today is, what is something core to your cultural beliefs that might not be widely known or understood, or that you would like other folks to know? And one, we want to remind folks that if you're going to say something or write something in the chat, make sure it's of your own culture. And of course, everyone has a different culture that they come from. So please feel free to share. And then Dr. Ray, do you have something that you would want to share?
Yeah, I think this is a beautiful question because we all have pieces of our culture that we consider normal that might not be ubiquitous. And for me, one of the things that I think is core is how we interact with elders. So people who are our elders, who are seniors, and discussion. So we always give them space. We prioritize them. We treat them. We feed them first, and that is also comes with time. So they often tell stories, and so we give them that space. I find like that's a conflict in our world because we're moving so fast, and we try to cut people off in their stories. So it's a very difficult thing that I balance with is making sure that I share that space culturally that we are supposed to give with the pace of our life. It's a great question and would love to see people's answers in the chat. And of course, please introduce yourself and where you're coming in from. We really appreciate that. Miguel, what about you? What do you think are core things to your culture that maybe aren't shared with everyone?
Yeah, one of the things that I grew up with was, and just kind of sticking to the animal world a little bit, was our mutual respect for animals. So American, or the culture that I saw as American, was very like babying of animals, which I kind of do too. I have that with me. But I grew up with a very like, the dog has a job and I have a job as a caretaker of this dog. But it was a very mutual type of relationship, which I didn't realize was different until I was much older. And then just kind of reading some of the things in the chat, I saw Geraldine share about respecting teachers. What else is there? Nadia, how much Latina folks love their pets and how we treat them like family, so much so we consider them the new generation of kids and grandkids in our families. That's very millennial also.
I love that. And I think something that's very difficult in our animal welfare world is when you come from a culture that doesn't eat meat, and those are core. Looks like Joanna shared that they felt like they have to explain that a lot, and so that's a perfect example of something that's really core to you as an individual, but maybe not seen by everyone in the world that you work in. So I think our speaker today is really going to be able to give us some tips and tricks about that.
Oh, thank you everyone who answered. So we're going to jump right into national updates. And quick reminder before we do that next week there's no meeting, the 31st, in observance of Eid, so there will be no call. And then yeah, I'll just go ahead and open it up real quick for any national updates.
Very quiet. Looks like there might be a couple on in the chat there. So my dog is my home virtual conference reminder about that. And this Thursday there's a behavior webcast. So see those links in that as well.
Thank you. I'll
So
pass it over to you, Dr. A, to introduce our speaker today.
yeah, without further ado, please join me in welcoming our speaker today. They're an exquisite veterinarian who is joining us after not only spending time in the actual clinic, doing a lot of emergency work, a lot of mentoring, and really being a representative of the next generation of veterinarians and wanting to really expand upon the cultural piece of that. Currently, she is a culture intelligence consultant, and she is the host of Critters and Cultures podcast. So, very excited for her to share some information with us today about cultural agility. So, join me in welcoming Dr. Azalia Boyd.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I am super, super excited to be here. I feel like it's very quiet today. So maybe I can get us making some noise in the chat, and maybe even if anybody feels like jumping off the mic so we can create noise, because in my culture, noise is a big part of who we are. Super, super excited. Thank you so much for Maddie's for making this space and inviting me onto the call. So I absolutely love that question of the day, which everyone's like dropping in different aspects of their culture. I think there's so much more that people could have added, because a lot of people don't realize that we all have culture, right? So I love, love, love to see that. So I'm going to go ahead and just share my screen. Today, we are going to talk about cultural agility. We are all superheroes on this call. I absolutely know it. And because we're all superheroes, we all have superpowers. But cultural agility is one of those superpowers that I do not believe that most people realize that they even need. Okay. So I want to just highlight that we're all superheroes, and I'll call you guys superheroes throughout the chat today. But then I really want to foster this superpower of cultural agility that I think will make our work so much easier. So the only thing that I ask is that I'm a connector, and I think so much of what I'm missing in this world right now is connecting with individuals, being able to reach out and touch you and see you eye to eye. So the only thing that I'll ask is, if there's a question, just drop some feedback in the chat, so this way we can kind of connect with each other. And so my first question to you guys is, what is your job? What is the superhero job that you guys are doing? What is the superhero job that you guys are doing? Whether that's your job title that you'd like to share, your work that you'd like to share. And I don't know if I can see the chat, which is kind of wonky. Let me try to pull it up here and see what we get. Okay. I'm just going to put this to the side for right now. What is your superhero job that you're doing? Creating a new animal rescue. Oh, CEO of Mobile Cat Cafe. Okay. Grant writer, shelter consultant, grant manager. I love it. I love it. I love it. I love it. Okay. Fundraising contracts. Keep those going, because I want to go back and look at all of these. All of these are superhero jobs, right? And all of us are trying to solve really, really big problems. I love absolutely all of that. Now, as you guys are putting that in the chat, the next thing that I want you guys to think about, and I'll go to the next slide, is, what problem are you trying to solve? The Humane Educator Coordinator, what problem are you trying to solve? Fostering kittens. What are those problems that we're trying to solve? Yes.
Excuse me. We do have a little thing blocking the top left of your
Okay.
screen.
Yes.
Wanna
It's the
bring that
chat. Let me move it here. And then I'll take it out of the way completely. What are the problems that we're trying to solve in our work? We're trying to find adopters. I'm assuming prevent neglect, find donors, funding and education on breed, find fosters, improving life-saving and educating the community, funding, money, keeping animals healthy. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Okay, so a lot of the problems, how to best educate community. That is awesome. A lot of us are trying to solve the same problem, right? Or at least in some aspect, we're working together to try to solve the same problem. I'm going to go to the next slide here. Oops, oops, oops. Here we go. Here we go. Okay. So this is a lot of what I was seeing in the chat, right? This is the vision that we're all sharing, right? Every single person on this call, whether you're in shelter, whether you're in rescue, nonprofit, advocacy, education, we want to see the same things happen in animal welfare, right? So our common goals, we want to decrease shelter intake. We want to reduce the number of pets entering into the shelters, right? increase adoptions, improve access to veterinary care. I saw someone put animal health, right? Build trust and relationships with the communities that we serve or partner with. That is a huge one. Ensure every pet has a loving home, increase access to care. These are the things that we're talking about in animal welfare right now. But despite all of our efforts, we are still running into challenges. And the question is why, right? If we are all on this call working with different organizations, but we have our common goals, why are we still finding that it's still so difficult to really get a good productivity on some of the goals that we're trying to achieve? So we're working for it. Why do we struggle? Why do certain communities not engage with shelters or veterinary care? Why do adoptions fall through? And so one of the things, of course, it's going to be multifactorial, but one of the missing pieces is cultural agility. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So it's not always, funding or better marketing. Sometimes it's something deeper, which is how we connect with each other, how we connect with the community that we're partnering with. And when I say each other, I mean individual organizations connecting with each other, co-workers connecting with each other. And I do believe that what's missing, a little piece of that, is cultural agility, okay? Because right now, as it stands, what's actually happening is people are distrusting shelters. People are distrusting veterinary clinics. Adoption policies unintentionally exclude potential pet owners. Sometimes communities don't feel welcome, so that leads to disengagement. Cultural misunderstandings, right, result in unnecessary surrenders and poor pet outcomes. So those are the things that are actually happening, and those are the things that we're all working to improve. So what is missing? I'm going to say cultural agility because I firmly believe that, and I'll talk about cultural intelligence too. Sometimes those two words I use interchangeably, but usually when I say the word culture, immediately some people think, oh, this sounds like a DEI conversation. My job is about animals, not about people. I had a friend who shared a story with me that said, he was championing some of this work in this conversation around culture and navigating cultural differences. And he said, the person said, well, why are we talking about culture when dogs and cats are dying, right, out in the street? And although that might be the gut reaction a lot of you have, or some of you have, right, culture and navigating cultural differences directly impacts the number of animals saved. When we dismiss it, we make our jobs harder and we actually put more pets at risk. So it might not be the end all to be all, but I do think it's a little bit lower on the totem pole than what we should be focusing on and bringing up higher. So again, we can work together and connect with communities more efficiently. So what is the superpower? You guys mentioned all the superpowers that you already have. What is that superpower? And that superpower is cultural agility. And that definition, if you guys just read closely, it is the ability. So this cultural agility is actually a skill. It is an ability to adapt and connect across different cultural contexts without letting our biases, our assumptions, or our misunderstandings get in the way. Okay. So again, it is a skill, it is an ability to navigate and respond effectively across different cultural contexts. Okay, so why now? What's happening now? Why cultural agility? The way we've done things for years and years in animal welfare and in vet medicine is not working. And that's why we are all trying to solve these heavy problems. We know that we've been trained in the skills that we have. We've been trained, for example, me, I've been trained in veterinary medicine. I can do surgery. Some of you have been trained in animal behavior or adoption policies. But what we don't do enough of is training in cultural communication, training in community trust building, understanding barriers to engagement. So what's at stake when we don't have those things? Shelters are going to remain overcrowded, okay? Adoptions are going to be lost. Families are going to be turned away. Veterinary access will continue to be unequal because cultural beliefs impact how communities actually engage. And the very hard truth is if we don't build these skills as a part of our work, we'll continue to see the same struggles in sheltering, in veterinary medicine, and in rescue work. So I'm going to just ask you, how much easier would your job be if we change the way we approach cultural differences? And I'll just give you a minute to just think about it. How much easier would our work be if we knew how to connect with people who needed us the most, or even connect with people that we're working with on a day-to-day basis? I'm going to say it would be a lot easier. And I hope some of you thought about some instances where, like, yep, that situation could have been a lot easier if I understood this individual's culture or this community's culture. It would make my job a lot easier. I would be less frustrated, right? Or, this adoption would have went a lot easier, a lot better. So before we talk about cultural agility, and throughout today's presentation, I do have some very short clips of the Critters and Cultures podcast, because culture is shared learning. We all carry it. It is a shared learning experience. So I do want to bring in some of those podcast clips for you guys to also learn from. So you'll listen to a few of those today. But we have to understand what culture is, right? Most of the time, people do think, when I say culture, they think nationality or ethnicity, right? And it's not always about nationality or ethnicity. We'll talk about where that comes from, but it's a shared belief, behaviors, and experiences that shape how we interact with the world. So some people will say culture is, in quote unquote, end quote, the way we do things around here, right? Every group, every workplace and community has its own norms, their own way of doing things. Another way of seeing culture is collective programming of the mind, ideas, behaviors, expectations that we absorb from our surrounding. And the other thing to note is culture is universal. It's not exclusive to specific groups. Every one of us in this call have culture. So it's not just something that other people have. It's something that we all have, and it affects everything that we do, including how people interact with animal welfare professionals. Okay, so that question of the day was perfect. Thinking about your own upbringing. What were some rules about animals that you grew up with, right? My family believed that pets belonged outside. They're Caribbean, and in their country, pets actually belong outside. So for the longest time, it was very hard for me to envision my dog inside. Maybe in your culture, they were seen more as family members. I did see that in the chat. Maybe you weren't allowed to have pets at all. Those beliefs are actually a part of your culture. So when we think about culture, looking at this diagram here, again, not just ethnicity or nationality, much broader. We have to expand the way we think about the word culture. It includes things like generations, boomers, Gen X, millennials, right? If we look at the top, that would be your top left, I think, in that corner of the United States, culture regions of the United States. If I'm from New York as well. So New Yorkers have a certain way of doing things that maybe people from Texas don't. That's all culture. If you look at the far right, where we have that cultural identity and those bubbles around that cultural identity, things like religion is a part. People don't speak about religion a lot, but that is a part of what makes up your cultural identity. Language, age, mental and physical ability, all of those things make up a part of your cultural identity. Now, if you look at the very bottom, I'm having you guys do all this eye shifting here, but discover the 10 cultural clusters on the bottom of the map of the United States. Those are from the Cultural Intelligence Center, where I got certified in learning about cultural intelligence. And these were the big classifications of clusters of where people might do things that are more similar, right? Those are more group global clusters by shared values and behaviors rather than just geography alone. So these clusters, and I'll give you an opportunity to ask questions at the end, but these clusters, they did a lot of research and a lot of backing on what were some of the differences between these groups. One of them was time orientation. So some cultures prioritize immediate outcomes, Others value long-term planning. So in a shelter, one staff member may push to adopt pets out quickly to save more lives, while another might want to ensure medical stability or behavioral stability first. Neither is wrong, but without cultural awareness and intelligence and agility, that's when you're going to start to get conflict, right? Decision making is another one that was identified. US culture often promotes individual decision making. So the individual is the primary unit, and autonomy and independence are highly valued in the United States. So we expect individuals here in the States to make their own decisions regarding their pet care, including health care. But in some cultures, family is the decision-making unit. So when a client wants to wait for their spouse or their parent or their sibling before surrendering, or before adopting an animal, or before approving a treatment plan for an animal, they're not indecisive. They're just honoring cultural norms, right? We'll talk a little bit about the religion and spirituality and how that may show up at a veterinary clinic or shelter door. But again, it's rarely a topic of conversation, but religious beliefs and spiritual practices are also common sources of conflict and misunderstanding. So faith might influence whether someone refuses to spay their pet or how they feel about euthanasia. But we rarely create space for those conversations in shelters, even though they deeply affect trust and outcomes. So without really understanding culture, what happens is we risk mislabeling clients as difficult when they might just be different from you, right? Creating friction on staff teams due to unspoken values that are clashing and missed opportunities to serve communities with compassion. Okay, so culture is very, very broad. Let's go to the next slide here. So when we think about culture, I gave you guys some examples. But if you look at this beautiful iceberg, I'm going to share that I used to be a park ranger in Alaska. Many people do not know that about me. It was one of the best jobs that I've had outside of being a veterinarian. But I would go on tours and give people information about icebergs and about bears and all of the fun stuff. I was at Denali National Park, if anyone's super interested in knowing that. But when you look at the iceberg, what many people don't realize is you're looking at this huge iceberg, and most of us only notice, all of us, we only notice the surface level. And it's the same way when we think about culture. Most of us only notice the surface level of someone's culture. But it is like an iceberg, and I think I spelled it wrong here. Pardon my typo. But what's visible is just a small part. 90 on average, 90% of the iceberg is not visible. Okay, so think about culture like an iceberg. The small part that you see above the surface is just the tip. It's just a fraction of the whole. That's what most people notice first. So if we think about it in respect to culture, language, food, clothing, holidays, etiquette, right? Those things are considered more on the surface. Those are the visible aspects. What's below the surface, that much larger part, is where most of the cultural misunderstandings and insights actually live. So that includes beliefs about time. Is being late disrespectful, or is it normal? Attitudes towards animals. Are pets considered family, or are they considered property? Ideas about status and hierarchy. Do you speak directly to leadership like your veterinarian, or do you defer to your elders? Okay. Communication style. Is honesty valued over harmony, or vice versa? Another big one that I think you guys have seen and heard is this notion of personal space or eye contact. Oh, they didn't make eye contact with me. They must be shady. Something must be going on. But those are things that are, again, that 90% below the surface. So why does this matter in shelters? Because when a client or coworker acts in a way that you don't understand, it's easy to assume that they're being rude or lazy or difficult. But in reality, they're just operating from below the surface, from cultural values that you may not share or may not even recognize. So just remember that iceberg. And when we do that, we get to shift from judgment to curiosity. So instead of asking, what's wrong with them, right? we begin to ask what might be influencing this behavior. And that shift alone can transform how we work with people and how we advocate for animals. Okay. So, cultural agility, it's moving just fine. Many people think that it is about memorizing a list of do's and don'ts for different cultures and backgrounds, but that approach doesn't actually help us in real situations. So agility is being able to, when you're agile, you're flexible. It's like learning how to drive, right? If you know how to drive in perfect weather, you'll struggle when it rains or snows. But when you have that cultural agility, that's knowing how to adjust when the conditions change. Okay. And so that's what I really want you to know. You can't study all of the 10 clusters and the geographic regions and all of the everything, but it's really knowing how to adjust when the conditions change so that everyone is still respected, so that people are heard. Okay. And that connection is actually still happening. Now, when we go back, I do want to bring out that yes, indeed, we all have culture. Our brains are wired to categorize information very quickly. So this helps us make sense of the world, but it can also lead to bias and stereotypes. So we do want to be very careful. Culture is how we see the world, but when we encounter cultural differences, and a lot of times that does relate to ethnicity and nationality, what happens is then this is where biases, stereotypes, prejudice, and judgments come into play. So if anyone's interested in learning whether they have this biases, Harvard does have an implicit bias test that you can take. It is absolutely free. And that is there on the bottom of the screen and can also be shared in the chat. So our way is not only the right way. Okay. When we start to think that our way is the right way, this is when we become disrespectful, not engaging. We lose trust. People don't want to listen to us. People will not engage with us, and where that conflict comes in. So the next slide I do want to share. It is Natalia Hansen. She runs a sterilization campaign in Colombia and South America. And so we were just having a dialogue. This is a clip from the Critters and Cultures podcast. And I do want you guys to just hear, as this is a shared learning opportunity, hear what Natalia has to say. Most of her sterilization campaigns are done, if not all of them, are done in marginalized communities in South America, Colombia. I heard someone say, just because my care doesn't look like your care, it doesn't mean I don't care, right? That was one of the most impactful quotes that I've heard. And it's true.
Yeah, it definitely is a reality. And to take a step back from what you were saying earlier is we need to understand that the way we care for our pets is not the right way. I feel like we tend to do that as humans in many other aspects of our lives. The way we cook, the way we eat, the professions we choose is the right way. No. So we need to really open our minds and understand that there are other correct ways of doing things. In this case, caring for our pets. And some may be seen as guard dogs. Like you said, we're not sleeping in bed with all of our dogs and cats all cuddled up.
So yeah, that's just a small clip of episode 15 with Natalia Hansen. And she, just so you know, does sleep with all of her dogs in the bed with her. But just highlighting that a culture is neither right nor wrong. It's appropriate for the current circumstances of the group. Okay, so moving on, there's 4 pillars of cultural intelligence. And so again, I use cultural intelligence and cultural agility interchangeably. But cultural intelligence, the abbreviated version of cultural intelligence is CQ, okay? So you'll see more of that term coming to life. Everyone's probably heard of EQ, emotional intelligence. You've heard of IQ, right? Your intellectual intelligence. And I know that's not what it stands for. Your intellectual ability. But CQ is a designed program that, again, has a lot of research that backs it, that allows you to kind of measure your progress when you're talking about cultural intelligence, okay? There's 4 pillars, and I won't get into those too detailed, but CQ drive is where it starts. That's your motivation and willingness to work across cultures. Then you have the CQ knowledge, which is your understanding of different cultural norms. Then it moves to cultural CQ strategy. So that's your ability to pause and plan and to think before reacting in cross-cultural situations. And then it goes to CQ action. And that's where that agility comes in, right? Your ability to adapt and adjust your behavior appropriately. Okay. So this is actually a trademarked term at this point. And given another example, let's say you're a shelter director and you notice a particular community isn't adopting from your shelter. A low CQ response would be they just don't care about their animals. Okay. A high CQ response would be let me take a step back and strategize. What barriers might they be facing? How can I build trust with this community? Right? That's where that CQ makes the difference. So I do encourage anyone, I do actually give assessment. So if anyone's interested in getting their organization assessed on this level of cultural intelligence that again has research back behind it, I would be happy to engage and work through strategies so that we can all have high CQ. So again, we're all superheroes. You're already doing the work. But if you're missing cultural intelligence, if you're missing that, you're making the work harder, way harder for yourself and for the industry, for the impact that we're trying to achieve. It is definitely a game changer. So I feel like I need to hurry up. So I'm going to speed through a little bit of this. The impact of cultural agility in animal welfare is the difference between trust and disengagement. Okay. When people feel seen, when they feel respected, they will engage with shelters and clinics and rescues more readily. So it's that difference between connection and missed opportunity. So instead of losing an adopter due to misunderstandings, you're creating a bridge that helps them succeed with their new pet or the circumstance that they're dealing with. Okay. So I want to show, I think the next slide is a video clip of, again, the Critters and Cultures podcast, where I speak to two wonderful people. I'll let you guys go ahead and listen to that.
How do you approach building trust in Indigenous communities?
The easiest way to build trust is just to talk to people and just talk to them like they're human and then find common ground, right? Like ask them about their pet, ask them how their pet got their name. And I think like when you begin to like build those relationships, people start to open up a little bit and then it just comes with time.
James, what about you? Are you actually, what I will say, in the field, like going out and working with these communities?
Yeah, I do go into the communities. Often I'm the first point of contact with increased access, and I'm not Indigenous, and so we do address that right off the hop typically, and make the point that again our board is largely Indigenous, but more importantly our membership is Indigenous, and really that first contact when we're starting to discuss if a nation wants to work with us is them sharing what their needs and wants are, and for us to share what the services are that we can provide.
So if anyone receives anything from that, I think was a beautiful clip. One, Dr. Emma Jackson was actually on a docuseries called Wild Rose Vets, where they did work. She's an Indigenous veterinarian and she did work in her community. So it was actually beautiful. She works with James Rogers, which I'd love if you guys throw that in the chat for increased access. And something that he mentioned was that he's not Indigenous, and they addressed that right off the bat, right? So if you got anything from that clip, please feel free to share it in the chat. I do think that was very powerful in a way that we talk about cultural differences and how we built trust. I'm going to show you one other clip. There's two more clips left in the session, but I'll show you one other clip from Altamush Saeed. He is in Pakistan and he works on interspecies justice. I want you to hear what he says about community trust and also how long it took him to gain that trust in Indigenous communities. In his communities in Pakistan. What are some of the challenges that you face when trying to push for animal welfare in a country where other societal issues take priority?
You just have to be kind enough to talk to people and explain your perspective. That's why we do interspecies justice work. Because if we only did animal rights work, our work may not have, succeeded or transpired into something impactful. So we make sure whenever we do anything, all of the concerns of everybody are incorporated. That's why human, animal, and environmental rights has to come together. So we make sure that all of those values are always there. So for example, if you're going to do a food drive, we would prefer plant-based because it solves the problem of food security as well. It's more healthy too, but it also keeps the animals out of the equation. And you cannot force anybody, to just go vegan, for example. It's a process, but you have to create that safe space first. Because if a stranger goes and talks to you, hey, this is how I think about the world, they will probably never listen to you. So you have to become their friend first.
Right.
We've been working in many areas for over 8 years now. So those communities know us, they understand us, where they're coming from. And that's why whenever we do anything, we always incorporate what they need first. How do we make sure animal welfare is respected and at the same time their needs are met? So
Okay, good. So Altamush, I think one of the things that I really wanted to highlight in there is my question was about what do we do when societal issues take precedence, right, over animal welfare, right? And it was a beautiful way that he used interspecies justice, the environment, the people and the animals all together, and really focusing on all of that time that he used to build that trust. He said 8 years to build that trust and always incorporating what the community needs are, right? So here is an example of what happens when we get it wrong. So some cultures do not, let's just say, for an example, spend a lot of money on their pets, right? And I want us to hear from Hannah Lentz, who is the CEO and founder of Spark, on a conversation that we had about adoptions.
I've been doing this all wrong. People are the problem.
I was afraid I was going to be judged. So what were some of the conversations that were had in that meeting that would make people maybe not be best adopters?
Oh gosh. There was one question in there, which is how much you were willing to spend on your pet. And it was the best answer was anything it takes, right? And some people would actually write a number. And if it wasn't a very high number, we would think, well, what are they thinking? I remember that question in particular because we would always go to it. We would look a lot at the histories that people had with pets. And if there was something that looked a little shady, like why didn't they keep that animal?
And this is an example of another way that we get cultural agility wrong. Some of you have maybe seen this before if you've sat in any of my presentations, so you can't give away the answer. But if you haven't seen this, I want you to take a look at this and someone put in the chat what we think Pringles, okay, this is not animal welfare, this is across industries. What do we think Pringles did culturally wrong or not having a high CQ? What do we think they did in this situation? And I don't know if somebody's already put it in the chat because the chat's not up. But I see some responses. Let's see. Everything. I agree with that, right? Muslims do not eat pork, and it's during a time where there's Ramadan Mubarak. That is the celebration of the Islamic culture, right? So this is an example of we don't always just get it wrong in animal welfare. Other industries get it wrong as well. It's just how we come up from this, how we get back from this, right? Thank you guys for putting those responses in the chat. Okay, so we can get it right, we can get it wrong. I'm going to share a very, very brief story of a time that we did actually get it right. There was a client that I had who came in with Moo. This is not actually a real picture of Moo. But Mr. Kane came in and his dog was very sick, in diapers, kidney disease, heart failure, all of the things that you guys can think of, was not mobile. And what I did was I talked to him about euthanasia, right? And he kept coming in week after week to get more fluids for Moo and to get more medications for her pain, for her joints, get more medication for her incontinence, and he refused to euthanize. And the staff was not very supportive, right? Dr. Boyd, tell him he needs to euthanize. This is inhumane. This is cruel. All of those stuff was happening. I'm feeling the pressure like, oh my goodness, my training has taught me that I need to tell this man he needs to euthanize. I continued to try to make Moo as comfortable as possible with what he wanted to do. And eventually he came back to me after Moo had passed and said, "Hey, Dr. Boyd, thank you so much. Moo passed at home. He brought flowers and chocolates." And I was like, "This is so nice. It's wonderful." And he then told me why he didn't want to euthanize. He said, "If I euthanized Moo, her spirit, the spirit of Moo would get trapped," and I'm paraphrasing here, but it would get trapped somewhere between heaven and hell, right? And that Moo would not be able to live a very, her afterlife comfortably. So I approached the situation without even realizing that it was cultural agility in action and speaking to him in action. But that's an example of, in the vet industry, in the vet world, actually getting it right. Have I always gotten it right? No. Is it something that requires continued learning? Absolutely. So in really quickly, because we don't have that much longer, there are three big barriers that I believe stopping us. Three common misconceptions. Okay. One, we treat everyone the same. So cultural agility doesn't apply to us, right? And when I hear that, I think that that is great idea in theory. We treat everyone the same. But in reality, treating everyone the same isn't necessarily treating them equitably, right? Different communities have different barriers to accessing pet care and adoption. If we ignore those differences, that's going to lead to missed opportunities and mistrust. Okay. For example, let's take a common shelter policy requiring a fenced yard for dog adoptions. It seems reasonable, right? Because we want the dogs to be safe. But what if you're in an urban community where most people live in apartments? So that rule automatically excludes entire populations who could be great pet owners. So that's not equal, that's equal treatment, but it's not great. It's an unintentional barrier. Okay. Another big one that I hear is cultural agility is just another term for DEI. So some people hear the word culture and immediately assume that this is another DEI conversation. I am not anti-DEI, but cultural agility is not just about diversity. It is about the skills that we need to have, that superpower that we need to have to be able to work effectively across our differences. Okay. It's not just a DEI initiative. It's not checking a box. It's not about politics. So it's really about that skill that we want to build. And the third big misconception is if people really cared about their pets, they would just do what we tell them to do, right? And that's one of the biggest mistakes that we also make in animal welfare, assuming that people must not care if they don't do what we tell them to do. But always remembering that pet care looks different across cultures, and love for animals is universal, regardless. The love for animals is definitely there. So an outdoor dog versus an indoor dog. Someone mentioned it in the chat earlier. Some cultures see dogs as guardians who belong outside. Spaying and neutering norms. Some communities, altering pets is seen as unnecessary and sometimes even harmful. Even feeding practices. Some families feed pet human food because it's seen as a sign of love and care. So that is another huge misconception. So as we close, I do want all of us on the call to really move from transactional to transformational thinking. I heard this on a podcast. I was listening to it. I was like, this is beautiful. This is blowing my mind. But cultural agility isn't about just checking a box. It's transforming how we approach our work. There is a difference between transactional thinking and transformational thinking. And I do think that changes everything. So transactional thinking is just going through the motions, filling out forms, processing applications, really without that deeper connection, following rigid policies with minimal efforts for relationship. I did my part. What else do they want us to do? And really move from that to a transformational thinking where we can all work together to create real change. Building trust before policies. So we understand first, and then we create sustainable solutions. Adapting, not just enforcing. We adjust our approaches to meet the needs of different communities, and leading with connection. Connection is huge, especially in this digital world. Relationships first and then guidance. Okay. Most people do things because they want to check it off the box. But transformational leaders They do things because they want to change the game. And I'd ask you guys, are we here to process adoptions and appointments, or are we here to change the way animal welfare partners and serves communities? And I hope you guys are feeling a little bit inspired to make that shift from transactional to transformational.
Dr.
Okay.
Boyd, thank you. I
Yes.
cannot thank you. We could talk to you forever.
Okay. Yes.
But we want to encourage everyone to be able to think about this and ask questions. And Dr. Boyd, thank you so much for joining us today. And you'll be able to join the chat this week. So as people are coming up with questions or comments, we would love to see them there. And Miguel, I think you have a little bit to wrap up there.
That was actually pretty much it.
That was it.
Feel free to continue with questions and continue the conversation on the Maddie's Forum. Thank you all so much for joining us. And thank you, Dr. Boyd.
Thank you. Thank you guys so much for having me.